In the summer of 1720, the smartest man in the world made a decision that would follow his name for 300 years. Isaac Newton had mapped gravity. He had calculated the motion of the planets, the tides, the light in a beam of sunshine, and he had put a large part of his fortune into a single company's stock. He watched it climb, sold near the top, and walked away with a handsome profit. He was out. He was safe. And then he watched it keep climbing. Everyone he knew was getting rich. So the greatest mind of his age did the one thing his own physics should have warned him against. He bought back in EY near the very top, and he lost around 20,000 pounds. A fortune. Enough to buy a country estate. Gone. There's a famous line he supposedly said afterward: "I can calculate the motions of the heavenly bodies, but not the madness of people." It's perfect. It's quoted in every book about this. And Newton almost certainly never said it. Because here's the strange thing. The company that ruined him owned almost nothing. It built nothing, made nothing. Its one real business was so grim that its own directors preferred not to talk about it. And yet, for a few months in 1720, this company that did nothing was worth more than all the gold and silver coin in England combined. People sold their homes to buy a sliver of it. And then, in a matter of weeks, it was worth almost nothing again. And here's the part that almost everyone gets wrong. This was not a madness. It was not a crowd that lost its mind by accident. It was built, deliberately, by a small group of men who engineered a machine that turned the nation's debt into shares and made themselves richer with every single pound the price went up. To keep it climbing, they bought the silence of the most powerful people in the country, the king, his mistresses, and most of Parliament. So how does a company worth nothing become the most valuable thing in England and then vanish? Who actually built the machine? And why, 300 years later, do we still tell the comfortable lie that everyone just went mad? This is case number 10. To understand how the fortune vanished, you first have to understand that it was never really there. The South Sea Company was founded in 1711 by a politician named Robert Harley, and from the outside it looked like an adventure. A grand trading company. Granted a monopoly on British trade with the rich Spanish colonies of South America, the South Seas, gold, silver, the wealth of a new world, sailing home in British ships. Almost none of that was real. Britain was at war with Spain when the company was founded, and Spain had no intention of opening its colonies to British merchants. There was, in the words of one historian, no realistic expectation that there would ever be a trade to exploit. The glamorous South Seas riches were a costume, a story printed on a charter. Underneath the costume, the South Sea Company was something far less romantic. It was a machine for managing the government's debt. Britain had spent years fighting expensive wars, and it owed enormous sums at high interest that it couldn't easily pay back, so the company was created to swallow a chunk of that debt, around £9 million of it, in exchange for a steady payment from the government and the right to sell shares. That was the real business, not trade, debt. And then there was the other business, the one the story was built to cover. In 1713, a peace treaty handed the company the thing it had actually been waiting for, a contract called the asiento. It was a monopoly, not on gold or spices or silk, but on human beings. The right to ship enslaved Africans across the Atlantic and sell them into the Spanish colonies. Over the life of that contract, the South Sea Company would transport more than 30,000 enslaved people. Thousands died in the crossing. This, not the imaginary treasure fleets, was the company's one genuine line of business. And here is the bitter irony at the heart of the whole story. Even that was barely profitable. The slave trade was brutal and expensive, and the company mostly lost money on it, using its one permitted annual ship as cover to smuggle other goods. The real fortune of the South Sea Company was never in a hold or a vault. There were no treasure fleets. There was a costume, a pile of government debt, and a monopoly on suffering that didn't even pay. So the company had almost nothing of real value. What it had instead was a story, a promise of riches that everyone wanted to believe. And in 1720, a small group of men figured out how to turn that belief into the largest fortune anyone in Britain had ever seen. They just had to build the machine. The man who designed it was not a lord or a merchant prince. His name was John Blunt, and he had started life as the son of a shoemaker, apprenticed to a scrivener, a kind of clerk who drew up contracts and lent money on the side. Blunt understood two things better than almost anyone alive: the fine print of finance and the psychology of a crowd. His idea was simple to say and dangerous to build. The government was drowning in debt. Ordinary people across Britain held that debt. They'd lent the government money and were owed steady interest. Blunt's plan was to persuade all of those lenders to trade what the government owed them for shares in the South Sea Company instead. Hand in your boring government IOU. Take our exciting stock. He tested it first in 1719, on a small scale. It worked. So in 1720, Blunt went for everything. A scheme to swallow more than £30 million of the national debt. The company even fought a bidding war against the Bank of England for the right to do it, and won. Now here is the mechanism. This is the whole trick. And once you see it, you can never unsee it. When someone traded in their government debt, the company paid them in shares, valued at the current market price. So watch what happens when the price goes up. If the shares are cheap, the company has to hand over a lot of them to cover a person's debt. But if the shares are expensive, it only needs to hand over a few, which leaves a big pile of leftover shares the company can then sell to the public for cash. Do you see it? The higher the share price climbed, the more free money the company created out of thin air, which meant the directors had exactly one job in the world: make the price go up and keep it going up forever. It was, in effect, a Ponzi scheme. 2 centuries before a man named Ponzi was ever born. The company had almost no real income, so the money to pay dividends, and the money to bribe the powerful, and the money the directors pocketed, all of it came from the rising price and from new investors buying in. New money, paying old promises. A machine that only works as long as it never, ever stops. And Blunt knew exactly how to keep it running. He let people buy shares on credit, put 10% down, pay the rest later, so anyone could gamble far more than they had. He had the company lend people money to buy its own shares, using those very shares as collateral, a loop so circular it should have made everyone dizzy. He spread rumors of fabulous South Seas profits that did not exist. And then he did the master stroke. He gave free shares, stock the recipients never had to pay for, to the people who could protect the machine, to the king's mistresses, to government ministers, to members of parliament, hundreds of them. They didn't have to invest a penny. They simply pocketed the profit as the price rose, which meant the most powerful people in Britain now had a personal reason to want that price to climb and to look away from how it was being done. Blunt had built a machine that turned belief directly into gold, and in the spring of 1720, he switched it on. What happened next is the part everyone remembers, and it's the part most people get wrong. The share price caught fire. It started the year around £128. By the summer, it was approaching 1,000, nearly 8 times over in a matter of months, on a company that still did almost nothing. The heart of it all was a narrow street in London called Exchange Alley, and the coffee houses packed into it, Jonathan's, Garraway's, where men shouted prices and traded scraps of paper for sums that would have bought whole villages. The letters people wrote at the time are genuinely stunned. "The madness of stock jobbing," one wrote, "is inconceivable." Another noted that it had simply become unfashionable not to be in the South Sea. But here's the correction, because it matters. The popular picture is of an entire nation gone insane. Footmen and maids and the common crowd all betting their wages. That's mostly a myth, invented and inflated long afterward. The people pouring fortunes into this were, overwhelmingly, the wealthy and the powerful. Something like 3/4 of the members of Parliament bought in. Lords, bishops, gentry, courtiers. This was not the madness of the mob. It was the greed of the establishment. And it was contagious in a very specific way. Because the South Sea price was soaring, a wave of imitators appeared. Around 190 other new companies floated to catch the same fever. Some were real. Many were absurd. One notorious advertisement, the story goes, offered shares in an undertaking of great advantage, but nobody to know what it is. That particular company may be a later legend, but the real ones were nearly as ridiculous. A company for a wheel of perpetual motion, a company for extracting silver from lead. Belief had become so cheap that people would fund almost anything. Holding the whole thing up was the corruption. The king himself was the company's governor, lending it the shine of the crown. His mistresses were quietly getting rich on their free shares. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, the man steering it all through Parliament, was secretly running the king's own stock trades on the side. Everyone who mattered was inside the machine, and everyone inside the machine wanted it to keep climbing. For a few golden weeks, people believed they had found something impossible, a way for everyone to get rich at once, forever. A clergyman could put his life savings in and watch it double. A widow could secure her future in an afternoon. The dream felt completely solid. It felt like the ground under your feet. And then Blunt's machine did something its makers never intended. To crush the imitators, the little companies siphoning off money that could have gone into South Sea stock, the directors pushed a law through Parliament that outlawed those rival ventures. It was called the Bubble Act, and it worked far too well. As the little bubbles were burst by the courts, nervous investors started asking a dangerous question. If those companies were worthless, what exactly was ours worth? For the first time, belief flickered. And the thing about a machine that runs on belief is that the moment it stops running forward, it starts running in reverse. It came apart in the autumn of 1720, and it came apart fast. The price began to fall. And falling was fatal because of how the machine was built. Remember? Thousands of people had bought their shares on credit. 10% down, the rest owed later. As long as the price rose, that was a dream. But now the payments were coming due on shares that were suddenly worth less than they'd promised to pay. So, they sold, which pushed the price down further, which forced more people to sell. The engine that had roared upward on borrowed money now ran backward on the same fuel. In September, the company's own bank, a firm called the Sword Blade, shut its doors and stopped paying out. Other banks began to fail. The paper fortunes that had felt like solid ground turned back into what they had always been, paper. And there, near the top, having bought back in at the worst possible moment, was Isaac Newton, losing his fortune along with everyone else. He was not ruined. He was a wealthy man and stayed one. But the greatest mind of the age had been caught by the oldest trap in finance, not because he was foolish, because the story was that good. Now, you'll hear that the crash triggered a wave of suicides that ruined men threw themselves from windows across London. Be careful with that one. The real economy of Britain barely flinched, Trade held, industry held. Most ordinary people were untouched. The devastation was concentrated almost entirely among the wealthy and the powerful who had gorged themselves on the story. This was not the ruin of a nation. It was the ruin of an establishment by its own greed. And that establishment wanted someone to blame. Parliament was recalled. An investigation tore into the company's books and found exactly what you'd expect. The bribes, the free shares, the corruption reaching all the way to the throne. The company's cashier, a man named Robert Knight, grabbed the ledger that recorded every secret payment. They called it the Green Book, and fled across the channel in the night. He was caught, and then he escaped again, and the Green Book was never seen. The evidence that could have named everyone simply vanished. Some were caught anyway. The Chancellor of the Exchequer was found guilty of the most notorious, dangerous, and infamous corruption, expelled from Parliament, and locked in the Tower of London. John Blunt, the architect, was stripped of nearly everything he owned, and one man rose out of the wreckage by making sure the scandal never touched the king or the ministers who mattered. His name was Robert Walpole, and for shielding the powerful, history remembers him by a nickname, the Screenmaster. He used the crisis to make himself the most powerful politician in Britain. We would later give the job he invented a title, Prime Minister. Here's the strangest thing of all. Britain survived. Across the Channel, a Scottish gambler named John Law had run almost exactly the same scheme in France just months earlier. And when it collapsed, it poisoned the entire nation's trust in banks and paper money for the better part of a century. But Britain absorbed the blow, kept its debts intact, and went on to build the most trusted financial system in the world. Same trick, opposite ending. The only difference was who kept believing, and for how long. The event even gave us a word. Before 1720, a bubble was one of those absurd little companies, a thing full of air, sure to pop. Afterward, the bubble meant the whole catastrophe. And ever since, we've used that word for the same story, told again and again. Because this is not really a story about the year 1720. Look at what money actually is. The cash in your wallet is paper, worth something only because everyone agrees it is. The number in your bank account isn't gold in a vault, it's a promise, a line in a database, a belief you share with millions of strangers. Every share, every currency, every fortune is, at bottom, a story we've all agreed to keep telling. And 1720 is what happens when the storytellers get greedy. The same shape you'll find in the railway mania, and the dot-com crash, and 2008 and every coin and craze since. Each one certain that this time is different. So let's go back to the smartest man in the world, and the line he never said. "I can calculate the motions of the heavenly bodies," Newton supposedly sighed, "but not the madness of people." It's a lovely quote, but it lets everyone off the hook, because it wasn't madness. There was no fever that swept in from nowhere and made a nation lose its mind. There was a machine, designed on purpose, by men who understood exactly what they were doing, and it ran on the one thing that feels like solid rock right up until the instant it turns to air. The South Sea Company was worth nothing, and then it was worth everything, and then it was worth nothing again. The treasure everyone chased was never real. It was a story. And a story is only worth something for as long as everyone agrees to keep telling it. I'm Cole. This was case number 10. The investigation continues.